The morning fog hadn't lifted yet when Trooper's growl changed everything. It wasn't the casual alert of a retired military K9 on routine patrol. This was the sound he made in Afghanistan when death was hiding in plain sight. Officer Dana Blake had seen her German Shepherd partner detect explosives, drugs, and weapons, but she'd never seen him claw desperately at an abandoned suitcase like something alive was trapped inside. The commuters at Riverstone Transit Station clutched their coffee cups, oblivious to the terror unfolding beneath a wooden bench. When Trooper's trained nose locked onto that battered maroon luggage, his body went rigid, tail straight as a rod, and Dana knew this wasn't about forgotten belongings. This was about survival. The suitcase had no tags, no owner nearby, and no explanation for why a combat-trained dog was scratching at it like his life depended on it. Then came the sound that stopped Dana's heart, a soft, muffled whimper from inside the case. Not an animal, not an adult, a child. In less than 5 minutes, a routine Monday morning would expose a secret so chilling it would shake the foundation of everything Dana thought she knew about protection, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a warrior dog and the innocent life he was born to defend. Dana's hands trembled as she unzipped the suitcase, the metallic rasp echoing in the suddenly silent station. The stench hit her first. Sweat, duct tape, fear. Then she saw the small pink and yellow sneaker, followed by wide, terrified eyes blinking up at her from the cramped darkness. The boy couldn't have been older than 4, mouth taped shut, wrists bound, knees pulled to his chest like he'd been folded into this hell for hours, maybe days. He was alive, but barely human anymore, just a trembling shell of innocence wrapped in trauma. As Dana lifted him into her arms, feeling his fragile body shake against her chest, one question burned through her mind. Who puts a living child in a suitcase and walks away? But that wasn't the most disturbing part. While paramedics rushed the boy to the hospital and investigators combed the scene for clues, a surveillance camera had captured something that would change everything. At 5:42 a.m., someone in a grey hoodie had calmly placed the suitcase under the bench. No panic, no hesitation, like they'd done this before. And when detectives enhanced the footage, they discovered a detail that would lead them down a rabbit hole of secrets. Lies, and a truth more complex than anyone was prepared for. The person who abandoned that child wasn't who they appeared to be, and this wasn't the first time. There are moments in law enforcement when everything you've been trained for converges into a single heartbeat of decision that will haunt you forever. This is the story of one such moment, where the keen instincts of a retired military K9 and the unwavering determination of his handler would expose a truth so devastating it would shake an entire community to its core. Officer Dana Blake had partnered with Trooper, a grizzled German Shepherd veteran, expecting nothing more than routine patrols through the sleepy corridors of Riverstone Transit Station outside Columbus, Ohio. Trooper had served multiple tours in Afghanistan, his nose trained to detect death before it could strike, his loyalty forged in the crucible of war, where split-second decisions meant the difference between soldiers coming home alive or coming home in flag-draped boxes. His pepper-grey coat bore the scars of service, his movements deliberate, but his amber eyes still burned with the fierce protective instinct that had saved countless lives in desert compounds half a world away. But on this particular Monday morning, as morning fog rolled through empty parking lots and tired commuters shuffled toward their daily routines, clutching coffee cups and worn briefcases, Trooper would detect something that would challenge every assumption about good and evil, victim and perpetrator, salvation and damnation. What appeared to be nothing more than an abandoned suitcase beneath a wooden bench would unlock a mystery stretching back years, involving a child who officially didn't exist in any government database, a woman branded as a kidnapper who might actually be a saint, and a foster care system so fundamentally broken that illegal rescue became the only viable path to legal justice. The investigation that followed would take Dana and Trooper through the charred remains of burned cabins, hiding evidence of makeshift homes built with love and desperation, through underground medical clinics serving those too afraid to seek official help, and deep into the dense woods where a woman had constructed a sanctuary for a boy the courts had systematically forgotten and abandoned. This isn't just another police procedural about finding missing persons or solving crimes. It's about the moral grey spaces between black and white, where heroes wear the masks of criminals, where trained dogs trust what educated humans cannot see, and where sometimes the greatest act of love requires breaking every law specifically designed to protect the innocent. As you follow this harrowing journey, from a morning growl that changed everything to a courtroom revelation that exposed institutional failure, you'll discover that the most dangerous predators often hide behind badges and briefcases and legal degrees, while the true guardians operate in shadows and silence, sacrificing everything, including their freedom, to shield those who cannot shield themselves. The pre-dawn darkness clung to Riverstone Transit Station like a shroud, broken only by the sickly yellow glow of sodium lights fighting a losing battle against the morning fog. Officer Dana Blake checked her watch, 6:15 a.m., another routine patrol in a town where the most exciting crime was usually teenagers spray painting abandoned buildings or domestic disputes that ended with handshakes and apologies. She leaned against her patrol car, finishing the last bite of a protein bar that tasted like cardboard and regret, while Trooper sat beside her in perfect military posture, his grey-peppered coat damp from the mist that seemed to seep into everything. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, the distant rumble of an approaching bus, the shuffle of early commuters emerging from cars with their thermal mugs and tired eyes, the mechanical wheeze of the station's PA system, crackling to life. Dana had learned to read Trooper's body language like a survival manual during their 2 years together, understanding that his stillness wasn't relaxation, but constant vigilance, his dark amber eyes scanning the environment with the methodical precision of a soldier who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan by never assuming safety. The morning felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on Dana's arms stand up, though she couldn't pinpoint why. A woman with a stroller struggled to keep her toddler from chasing pigeons near the ticket booth, while 2 teenagers shared earbuds and argued about something only they found important, their voices cutting through the pre-commute quiet. Everything appeared normal, bordering on mundane, the kind of peaceful Tuesday morning that made Dana question whether she'd made the right career choice after leaving the military herself. But then Trooper's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. His relaxed, surveillance posture snapping into combat alertness with the precision of a loaded weapon. His ears shot forward, his spine straightened, and a low growl began building in his chest. Not the casual warning he gave to aggressive squirrels or territorial cats, but the deep, primal sound he'd made in desert compounds when improvised explosive devices were hidden in seemingly innocent packages. Dana's hand instinctively moved to her service weapon as she followed Trooper's laser-focused gaze toward the far end of the platform, where a battered maroon suitcase sat beneath a wooden bench, unremarkable except for its complete abandonment, and Trooper's sudden, overwhelming need to investigate it with the intensity of a dog who had just detected something that shouldn't exist. Trooper's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying, his years of retirement stripping away like shed skin to reveal the war-hardened detection specialist beneath. The low growl escalating from his chest wasn't a sound Dana had heard since their first week together, when he'd alerted to a suspicious package that turned out to contain enough fentanyl to kill half the county. His powerful haunches coiled like loaded springs as he pulled against his leash with a force that nearly yanked Dana off balance, his black nose working overtime to process scents invisible to human perception but crystal clear to his genetically enhanced olfactory system. The suitcase itself looked innocuous enough, faded maroon, Fabric with scuffed corners, one wheel completely missing, the kind of forgotten luggage that cluttered bus stations and airports across America every single day. But Trooper's reaction suggested something far more sinister than abandoned vacation clothes or forgotten business documents. His scratching became frantic, almost desperate, both front paws clawing at the worn fabric with the urgency of a dog trying to dig his way to salvation. Dana's training kicked in with military precision as she waved urgently toward a nearby transit security guard, her voice cutting through the morning air with unmistakable authority. "Clear the platform now. Get everyone back immediately." The handful of early commuters looked up from their phones and coffee cups with the confused irritation of people whose routines had been unexpectedly disrupted. But something in Dana's tone brooked no argument as they began shuffling toward the station entrance with reluctant compliance. The security guard, a middle-aged man whose biggest concerns usually involved teenagers loitering and homeless individuals seeking shelter, approached with obvious nervousness as he surveyed the scene. "Bomb threat?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with the weight of a responsibility he'd never been trained to handle. Dana kept her eyes locked on Trooper, whose behavior had escalated beyond anything in her experience with him, his entire body trembling with the effort of restraint as every instinct screamed at him to tear that suitcase apart. "Could be," she replied tersely, though something deep in her gut suggested this was different, more personal somehow, as if Trooper wasn't detecting an explosive device, but something that offended his very soul. The German shepherd suddenly stopped scratching and sat perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the suitcase with the unblinking intensity of a predator locked onto prey. And then he did something that made Dana's blood run cold. He whined, a high-pitched sound of distress she'd never heard from him before, as if whatever was inside that luggage was calling to every protective instinct evolution had hardwired into his DNA. The morning air felt thick as Dana crouched beside Trooper, her hand instinctively moving to her radio to call for backup, while her mind raced through protocols she'd memorized but never hoped to use. The German shepherd's whine had evolved into something more urgent, more desperate, his massive head tilting toward the suitcase like he was trying to hear something beyond human perception. Dana's finger hovered over the radio button when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself it was her imagination, barely audible above the distant hum of traffic and the mechanical wheeze of the station's ventilation system. It came again, unmistakable this time, a soft, muffled whimper that seemed to originate from inside the luggage itself, not the electronic beeping of a timer or the mechanical hum of device, but something organic, something alive, something that made every protective instinct in her body scream with recognition. Her breath caught in her chest as the implications hit her like a physical blow. There was someone inside that suitcase, someone small enough to fit in such a confined space, someone who had been making sounds soft enough that only a dog with Trooper's enhanced hearing could detect them. The whimper came a third time, followed by what sounded like a suppressed sob, and Dana felt her knees nearly buckle as she realized she was listening to a child in distress. Her training warred with her maternal instincts as she fought the overwhelming urge to tear the suitcase open immediately, knowing that protocol demanded she wait for the bomb squad, while every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death for whoever was trapped inside. Trooper seemed to sense her internal struggle, his amber eyes meeting hers with an expression that communicated more clearly than words. "There's a life in there, and time is running out." The platform had been cleared except for the security guard who stood at a safe distance, his face pale with the dawning realization that this wasn't a routine security issue, but something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Dana's radio crackled with static as dispatch confirmed that specialized units were en route, but the estimated arrival time of 10 minutes felt like an eternity when weighed against the increasingly desperate sounds emanating from inside the luggage. She could hear movement now, subtle but unmistakable, the sound of someone shifting position in an impossibly cramped space, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever was happening here had moved far beyond the realm of standard police procedure into territory where split-second decisions would determine whether she saved a life or became complicit in a tragedy that would destroy her soul. Time suspended itself in that moment between protocol and humanity, between following orders and following conscience, as Dana stared at the suitcase that had become the epicenter of a moral earthquake threatening to shatter everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. The sounds from inside the luggage were becoming more frequent now, tiny movements that spoke of cramped limbs and restricted breathing, of a living being folded into a space never meant to contain human life. Trooper had positioned himself directly in front of the suitcase like a guardian angel, his body language screaming with the urgency of a dog who understood that every passing second decreased the chances of survival for whatever precious cargo lay hidden behind that worn zipper. Dana's hand trembled as she reached for her service weapon, not to use it but to steady herself as she made the decision that would either define her as a hero or destroy her career forever. The radio chatter in her earpiece felt distant and irrelevant as dispatchers coordinated response units that wouldn't arrive in time to matter, their clinical discussions of procedure and protocol sounding like noise from another dimension, while a child's life hung in the balance mere feet away from her. She dropped to her knees beside the suitcase, her fingers finding the main zipper with the delicate precision of a surgeon performing heart surgery, knowing that one wrong move could trigger an explosive device or cause further trauma to whoever was trapped inside. The metal zipper felt cold against her fingertips as she began to pull it slowly, the rasping sound of its movement seeming to echo across the empty platform like thunder in a cathedral. The first inch revealed darkness, the second brought the overwhelming stench of human fear and confinement, and by the third inch she could see a flash of color that made her heart stop completely. A small pink and yellow sneaker, child-sized and innocent, attached to a leg that shouldn't have been able to fit in such a confined space. Her breath came in short gasps as she continued opening the suitcase with agonizing care, each new inch revealing more of the horror within. Tiny hands bound with duct tape, knees drawn up to a small chest in the fetal position of ultimate vulnerability, and finally a pair of wide, terrified eyes blinking up at her from a face that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 4 or 5 years. The boy's mouth was sealed with tape, his breathing shallow and rapid, his entire body trembling with the kind of fear that comes from having been folded into darkness for longer than any human being should have to endure. And as Dana reached down to lift him from his makeshift prison, she realized that this moment would divide her life into 2 distinct chapters, before and after she opened a suitcase and found innocence packaged like cargo. The child weighed almost nothing in Dana's arms, his small body folded and compressed like a broken bird, every muscle tense with the kind of trauma that rewrites a person's entire understanding of safety and trust. His wide brown eyes stared up at her with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, the tape across his mouth muffling what might have been attempts at speech, or simply the ragged breathing of someone who had been convinced they were going to die in darkness. Dana's hands shook as she gently peeled away the duct tape from his lips, her heart breaking at the angry red marks the adhesive had left on his pale skin, evidence of how long he had been silenced and bound. He didn't cry when freed, didn't scream or call for his mother. He simply stared at her with the hollow gaze of someone far too young to understand why adults had done this to him, but old enough to know that the world was a much more dangerous place than he had ever imagined. Trooper moved closer with the careful precision of a therapy dog, his massive head lowering to sniff gently at the boy's trembling hand. And for the first time since emerging from the suitcase, the child showed a flicker of recognition, his fingers reaching out tentatively to touch the German shepherd's graying muzzle. The contact seemed to ground him somehow, as if the dog's presence provided a bridge between the nightmare he had just escaped and the possibility that not all living things were sources of pain and fear. Dana's radio crackled urgently as she reported the situation, her voice steady despite the emotional hurricane raging. Inside her chest, "This is Blake, we have a live child. Repeat, a live child, requesting immediate ambulance and trauma response. Victim appears to be male, approximately 4 to 5 years old. Signs of restraint and possible extended confinement." The boy's breathing began to slow as she held him, his body gradually relaxing against hers, with the tentative trust of someone who had been given no reason to believe in kindness, but was willing to take a desperate chance on it anyway. His clothes were clean but wrinkled, his hair neat but unwashed, suggesting someone had cared for his appearance while simultaneously treating him like cargo to be transported rather than a human being to be cherished. The ambulance sirens were already wailing in the distance when Dinah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Around the boy's thin wrist was a hospital bracelet, faded and worn, with no name visible but a series of numbers that suggested he had been a patient somewhere, somehow, and someone had taken him from whatever facility had been treating him. Trooper whined softly and licked the child's hand again, his instincts recognizing what Dana was beginning to understand. This wasn't a random kidnapping or a crime of opportunity, but something far more complex and sinister, involving someone who had access to vulnerable children and the knowledge of how to make them disappear from systems designed to protect them. The ambulance doors slammed shut with the finality of a chapter, ending, taking the nameless boy towards St. Mary's Hospital, while Dana stood in the parking lot, feeling like she'd just watched someone's entire world get loaded into a vehicle and driven away. Trooper remained agitated even after the child had been safely transported, his nose working overtime as he circled the now empty suitcase with the methodical precision of a detective gathering evidence that only he could detect. Detective Ray Moreno arrived within minutes, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the scene that had already been cordoned off with yellow tape and flooded with crime scene technicians, whose cameras flashed like lightning against the grey morning sky. The suitcase itself told a story written in scuff marks and wear patterns, its fabric bearing the invisible signatures of multiple hands and locations, while the bench beneath which it had been placed showed no signs of disturbance, as if whoever had left it there knew exactly where surveillance cameras couldn't reach, and foot traffic would be minimal. Ray's initial examination of the security footage revealed a figure in a grey hoodie approaching the platform at 5:42 a.m., moving with the calm deliberation of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan rather than the frantic energy of a panicked criminal trying to dispose of evidence. The person's face remained hidden throughout the entire sequence, their movements suggesting familiarity with the station's layout and an understanding of when the area would be most deserted, yet their body language conveyed none of the nervous energy typically associated with someone committing a felony. What disturbed Dana most was the gentleness with which the hooded figure had placed the suitcase beneath the bench, setting it down with the careful consideration of someone handling something precious rather than the rough disposal of unwanted cargo, suggesting a relationship with the child that was far more complex than simple abduction. The first 24 hours of investigation yielded more questions than answers, as missing person reports were cross-referenced with hospitals, schools, and social services databases, revealing no child matching the boy's description who had been reported missing within the past week, month, or even year. His fingerprints weren't in any system, his photograph didn't match any amber alerts, and his DNA would take weeks to process through national databases that might not contain his genetic information anyway, if he had never been formally entered into any government system. The hospital bracelet around his wrist led to a dead end when the numbers were traced back to a pediatric facility that had closed 6 months earlier, its patient records sealed or destroyed, according to privacy laws that now seemed designed to protect predators rather than victims. Trooper's behavior during the investigation remained the most reliable source of information as he continued to alert to specific scent trails that led from the bench area toward the parking lot, then mysteriously disappeared as if whoever had left the boy had simply vanished into thin air. 3 days into the investigation, the boy still hadn't spoken a single word, communicating only through gentle nods and the kind of wide-eyed observation that suggested he was cataloguing every face, every sound, every potential threat in his new environment with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant assessment of danger. The pediatric trauma specialists at St. Mary's Hospital described his behavior as consistent with prolonged psychological conditioning, the kind of systematic suppression of natural childhood responses that didn't happen overnight but required months or even years of careful manipulation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead psychiatrist assigned to his case, explained to Dana that the boy's silence wasn't necessarily fear-based, but could represent a learned survival mechanism, a way of making himself invisible and unthreatening to adults who had taught him that speaking brought consequences too terrible to risk. His physical examination revealed no signs of sexual abuse, but clear evidence of long-term confinement. Muscle atrophy consistent with restricted movement, vitamin deficiencies suggesting limited access to proper nutrition, and pressure sores on his shoulders and hips that indicated extended periods spent in cramped positions. The hospital bracelet that had initially seemed like a promising lead turned into another dead end when the facility's former staff members were interviewed, none of whom remembered treating a child matching his description, though their personnel records showed that several employees had left abruptly in the weeks before the hospital's closure, their forwarding addresses either non-existent or leading to apartments that had been vacant for months. Ray's investigation into the surveillance footage yielded one breakthrough when image enhancement software managed to isolate a partial view of the hooded figure's left hand, revealing what appeared to be a distinctive bracelet made of woven pink and white thread, the kind of friendship bracelet typically made by children or young women, suggesting that whoever had left the boy might have been female or at least wanted to appear feminine. The breakthrough came when Dana was sitting beside the boy's hospital bed during one of her regular visits. Trooper lying on the floor with his head resting on his paws, while the child absently stroked the dog's ears with the kind of automatic affection that spoke of long familiarity with canine companionship. A nurse had brought him a box of crayons and paper, standard therapy materials designed to help traumatized children express emotions they couldn't verbalize, and after an hour of silent observation, he began to draw with the focused intensity of someone translating memories into images. His first drawing showed a stick figure, child, standing beside a much larger dog, not the blocky, disproportionate artwork typical of his age group, but something rendered with careful attention to detail that suggested he was recreating a specific memory rather than engaging in imaginative play. The dog in his drawing had the distinctive pointed ears and long snout of a German shepherd, but it wasn't Trooper. This animal was younger, darker, with a collar that bore what looked like a name tag, and when Dana leaned closer to examine the careful crayon strokes, she could make out letters that spelled a name that would change everything. Scout. The name Scout unlocked something in the boy's fractured psyche, and for the first time since emerging from the suitcase, he whispered a single word that sent chills down Dana's spine: home. His voice was barely audible, roughened by days of silence and the lingering effects of having tape sealed across his mouth for hours, but the longing in that one syllable contained universes of loss and desperate hope for something he believed he would never see again. Dana leaned forward carefully, afraid that any sudden movement might cause him to retreat back into protective silence, and asked gently if Scout was his dog, receiving a shake of the head that indicated something more complex than simple ownership. Through a combination of patient questioning and the boy's hesitant responses, a picture began to emerge of a life lived in isolation with a woman he called Mama Mila and a German shepherd named Scout, who served as both companion and protector in what sounded like a makeshift family unit operating completely outside any official system. His drawings became more elaborate over the following days, revealing details of a cabin in the woods, a vegetable garden tended by gentle hands, bedtime stories read by lamplight, and always the faithful presence of Scout, who appeared in every image as both guardian and friend. The boy's name he finally revealed in a whisper that required Dana to lean so close she could feel his breath against her ear, was Miles, and he had been living with Mama Mila for lots of sleeps in a place where nobody could find us and hurt us anymore. Ray's investigation took on new urgency when the boy's fragmented memories were cross-referenced with missing person reports, revealing that a child named Miles Hollis had disappeared from the foster care system nearly 3 years earlier after being placed with a family whose background check had somehow missed several red flags that became apparent only after the boy had vanished. The case had been officially closed after 6 months, when no leads materialized and no evidence of foul play could be established, but the caseworker's notes contained references to an aunt who had repeatedly tried to gain custody and had been deemed unfit due to her unstable housing situation and lack of steady employment. The aunt's name was Camilla Rains, a former military medic whose service record showed deployment to Afghanistan, where she had worked with K9 units, explaining her comfort with large dogs and her ability to disappear completely when motivated by desperation and love. Phone records from the closed case file showed dozens of calls from Camilla to child services in the weeks before Miles disappeared, pleading with caseworkers to investigate reports of abuse that were apparently dismissed as the desperate lies of a woman trying to gain custody of a child she had no legal right to claim. The last entry in the case file was a note from the supervising social worker stating that Camilla Rains had stopped calling and was presumed to have moved on, but Dana now understood that she hadn't moved on at all. She had moved into action, rescuing Miles from a system that had failed him and creating a sanctuary where a traumatized child could heal under the protection of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love requires becoming a criminal. In the eyes of a law that values procedure over protection, the revelation of Camilla Rains' identity transformed the investigation from a straightforward kidnapping case into something far more morally complex, a web of institutional failure and desperate love that challenged every assumption Dana had made about victims and perpetrators. Ray's deep dive into Camilla's background revealed a woman whose life had been defined by service and sacrifice. 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, commendations for valor under fire, and a specialty in working with military K9 units that explained her ability to train Scout as both companion and protector for Miles during their years in hiding. Her discharge papers told a story of psychological wounds that ran deeper than physical scars, with notes about survivors' guilt and difficulty adjusting to civilian life, but nothing that suggested the kind of instability that would justify denying her custody of her nephew when the alternative was placing him with strangers who had somehow slipped through a background check system designed to protect vulnerable children. The trail of Camilla's movements over the past 3 years painted a picture of someone living completely off the grid, paying for everything in cash, avoiding cameras and official documentation, moving from one remote location to another with the tradecraft of someone whose military training had taught her how to disappear when survival depended on invisibility. Witnesses in small towns across 3 states remembered a quiet woman with a young boy and a well-trained German shepherd, always polite but never staying long enough to form relationships that might compromise their security or attract unwanted attention from authorities. The burned cabin Ray had discovered in his investigation of the bus route yielded forensic evidence that confirmed their worst fears about why Camilla had been forced to abandon the sanctuary she had built for miles in the Suitcase wilderness. Accelerant patterns suggested the fire had been deliberately set, but not by Camilla. The burn patterns indicated someone had tried to destroy evidence of their presence, possibly after discovering their location through methods that spoke of resources far beyond those available to typical bounty hunters or private investigators. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the destroyed cabin, crime scene technicians found a waterproof container holding photographs that told the story of Miles' transformation from a traumatized, hollow-eyed child into someone who smiled and played and trusted again under Camilla's patient care. Scout always present as both playmate and sentinel. The final photograph in the collection showed Miles sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bed, surrounded by handmade toys and picture books. Scout curled protectively beside him, and the image carried a handwritten note on the back that would haunt Dana's dreams. If something happens to me, please remember that he was loved completely, even if it was against the law. The investigation team realized that Camilla hadn't abandoned Miles callously, but had been forced to make an impossible choice when their hiding place was discovered, choosing to place him where he would be found quickly by trained professionals, rather than risk his capture by whoever had been hunting them through the wilderness, with resources and determination that suggested official backing rather than random criminal intent. Pieces of Camilla's desperate gamble began falling into place when Ray's investigation uncovered evidence that someone with access to law enforcement databases had been systematically tracking their movements across 3 states, using resources available only to those with official credentials and authorization to access restricted information systems. Phone records from the weeks before the cabin fire showed multiple calls to Child Protective Services from someone claiming to have spotted Miles with his kidnapper, calls that were traced back to a burner phone purchased with cash but activated in proximity to cell towers near the courthouse where Miles' original custody case had been decided 3 years earlier. The caller's intimate knowledge of Miles' appearance, Camilla's background, and their general movement patterns suggested someone with direct access to sealed case files and ongoing surveillance capabilities that extended far beyond normal civilian resources, painting a picture of institutional corruption that reached into the very agencies supposedly designed to protect vulnerable children. Dana's late-night visit to the closed case files revealed a pattern of irregularities that should have triggered internal investigations, but had somehow been overlooked or deliberately ignored by supervisors more concerned with maintaining plausible deniability than ensuring child safety. The original foster family that Miles had been placed with maintained financial connections to several board members of the private agency that had conducted their background check, a conflict of interest that should have disqualified them from consideration, but had been buried under layers of bureaucratic paperwork designed to obscure rather than illuminate the decision-making process. Hospital records obtained through careful legal maneuvering showed that Miles had been treated for injuries consistent with systematic abuse during his brief placement with his court-appointed guardians, injuries that had been documented but never properly investigated due to what the attending physician described as unusual pressure from administrative personnel to avoid pursuing mandatory reporting procedures. The revelation that emerged from cross-referencing these medical records with Camilla's phone logs was devastating. She had been calling Child Protective Services not to harass caseworkers or pursue a frivolous custody claim, but to report specific evidence of ongoing abuse that she had witnessed during supervised visits, evidence that had been systematically ignored or suppressed by the very people whose job was to protect Miles from exactly the kind of harm he was experiencing. The final piece of the puzzle came when DNA analysis of hair samples found in the burned cabin were matched against samples from Miles's hospital admission, confirming that Camilla had indeed been caring for the same child who had disappeared from foster care 3 years earlier, but also revealing something that changed the entire legal and moral framework of the case. Genetic testing showed that Camilla wasn't just an aunt seeking custody of her nephew, but Miles' biological mother, whose parental rights had been terminated through legal proceedings based on deliberately falsified evidence that painted her as unfit while simultaneously covering up the abuse being perpetrated by the foster family who had paid substantial sums to ensure their application was approved despite their disqualifying criminal background. The deeper Dana and Ray dug into the conspiracy surrounding Miles's case, the more they uncovered a network of corruption that extended like poisonous roots through multiple agencies, private contractors, and individuals who had turned child welfare into a profitable enterprise built on the systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. What had begun as a single case of suspected kidnapping had evolved into an investigation that would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated human trafficking operations ever discovered, operating within the legitimate framework of American Child Protective Services. Court documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that the private agency responsible for vetting Miles's foster family had been paid nearly $50,000 in consulting fees by a shell corporation linked to the same people who had been granted custody, creating a financial incentive structure that rewarded placing children with families willing to pay premium prices rather than those best equipped to provide safe, nurturing environments. The paper trail led investigators through a labyrinth of holding companies, offshore accounts, and charitable foundations that existed solely to launder money generated by what could only be described as the systematic auction of vulnerable children to the highest bidders, regardless of their qualifications or intentions. The presiding judge in Miles's original custody hearing had retired abruptly just 6 months after making the decision to remove him from Camilla's care, relocating to a state with no extradition agreements and purchasing property worth far more than his government salary could have supported, suggesting that his sudden departure might have been motivated by something more substantial than a desire for peaceful retirement in a climate more favorable to his arthritis. Financial forensics revealed that Judge Harold Westbrook had received payments totaling over $200,000 through a series of speaking engagements at conferences that either never took place or were attended by the same individuals who had benefited from his custody decisions, creating a clear pattern of quid pro quo arrangements that had turned his courtroom into a marketplace where children's futures were sold to fund his lavish lifestyle. Internal emails recovered from the Child Protective Services computer system painted a picture of an agency more concerned with maintaining relationships with lucrative private contractors than protecting the children in their care, with multiple references to Camilla's persistence being treated as a public relations problem rather than credible reports of abuse that demanded immediate investigation and intervention. Caseworker Maria Santos, whose conscience had finally overcome her fear of retaliation, provided testimony that revealed systematic pressure from supervisors to ignore evidence of abuse when it involved families who had paid substantial fees for placement services, with threats of termination and blacklisting used to ensure compliance from social workers who might otherwise have followed mandatory reporting protocols. The most disturbing discovery came when forensic accountants traced the financial connections between Miles' foster family, the vetting agency, and a larger network of individuals involved in what could only be described as a systematic trafficking operation disguised as legitimate child placement services, with children being moved between families based on their willingness to pay fees that sometimes exceeded six figures for access to vulnerable minors who had been deliberately isolated from anyone who might advocate for their welfare or question their treatment. The operation's sophistication became apparent when investigators discovered that children were being psychologically conditioned to accept abuse as normal through carefully designed isolation techniques that severed their connections to extended family members, friends, or community support systems that might have noticed changes in behavior or physical evidence of mistreatment. Scout's disappearance during the cabin fire took on new significance when veterinary records showed that the German Shepherd had been microchipped with tracking technology typically reserved for military working dogs, suggesting that Camilla's military connections had provided resources for protecting Miles that extended beyond her own training and into networks of veterans who understood that sometimes the greatest threats to innocent lives came from within the very institutions supposedly designed to shield them from harm. The chip's data logs, recovered from the veterinarian who had implanted the device, showed that Scout had been trained not just as a companion, but as an early warning system, capable of detecting the specific pheromone signatures associated with fear and aggression that would have alerted Camilla to approaching danger long before conventional surveillance methods could have provided adequate warning. The investigation uncovered evidence that at least 17 other children had been processed through the same corrupt system over a 5-year period, each one removed from caring relatives or potential guardians who couldn't afford the hidden costs of securing custody, then placed with families whose qualifications seemed inversely related to their ability to pay substantial under-the-table fees for access to children who would never be missed, because their cases had been deliberately mishandled by caseworkers who had been either bought off or intimidated into silence by people with enough resources and connections to make careers disappear as easily as they made children vanish into homes where screams would never be heard by neighbors who had been paid to remain deaf to anything that might interfere with business as usual. The scope of the conspiracy became clear when FBI raids on the homes and offices of the primary conspirators revealed detailed records of children's psychological profiles, medical histories, and behavioral assessments that had been used to match them with specific types of abusers based on their preferences and requirements, treating vulnerable minors like catalog items to be selected and purchased based on characteristics that would make them ideal victims for particular forms of exploitation. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that the network had been expanding its operations to include international adoption services, with plans to begin trafficking children across national borders using the same legitimate-appearing infrastructure that had allowed them to operate undetected for years within the American foster care system, suggesting that Miles's rescue had interrupted a criminal enterprise with global ambitions and the resources necessary to achieve them. 6 months after Trooper's morning growl changed everything, Officer Dana Blake stood in a courtroom where justice wore an unfamiliar face, and truth emerged from the ashes of institutional betrayal like a phoenix rising from deliberate destruction. The mahogany-paneled room that had once been the site of Miles' illegal removal from his mother's care now bore witness to a very different kind of proceeding. One where evidence spoke louder than money, and corruption finally faced consequences that couldn't be bought, buried, or intimidated into silence. Camilla Raines sat at the defendant's table, no longer the shadowy figure from surveillance footage, but a woman whose every sacrifice had been vindicated by evidence that painted her not as a kidnapper, but as the only person willing to risk everything to save a child the system had literally sold to predators wearing the masks of respectability and community standing. Her military bearing remained intact despite months of legal proceedings that had dissected every Decision she'd made during 3 years of protecting Miles from a system that had failed him so completely that illegal rescue became the only path to legal justice. Miles, now legally restored to his birth name and his mother's custody, sat in the front row holding Dana's hand, while Trooper lay at his feet, the three of them forming an unlikely family forged in crisis and tempered by the kind of loyalty that transcends blood relations or legal documents. The boy who had emerged from a suitcase, unable to speak, now chatted quietly with the dog who had saved his life, their conversation consisting of whispered secrets and gentle touches that spoke to a healing process that would continue for years, but had finally begun in earnest. The judge's final ruling didn't just exonerate Camilla, but triggered a federal investigation that would eventually expose the trafficking network to scrutiny, powerful enough to topple careers, freeze assets, and send several prominent community members to federal prison, where their reputations would provide no protection from the justice they had systematically denied to children who couldn't fight back against adults who had turned their vulnerability into profit margins. The private agency that had facilitated the corrupt placements was dissolved, its assets seized to fund victim compensation programs, while the judge who had originally separated Miles from his mother faced federal charges for accepting bribes that had directly resulted in child endangerment on a scale that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Yet as Dana watched Miles laugh at something Camilla whispered in his ear, she couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was simultaneously complete and insufficient. Justice served alongside the haunting knowledge that 17 other children remained missing, their cases buried under layers of corruption so deep that even federal investigators might never reach the bottom of conspiracies that had turned child protection into child exploitation, with surgical precision and institutional support. The commendation ceremony that followed painted Dana and Trooper as heroes, complete with medals and speeches about the thin blue line protecting society from those who would harm the innocent. But she understood that heroism sometimes consisted of nothing more than refusing to ignore what everyone else had been paid or intimidated into pretending not to see, of trusting a dog's instincts over human. Assurances that everything was fine when children were screaming in silence behind doors that money had taught authorities never to open. Trooper's final act in the case came when his handler let him choose his own retirement, and the aging German shepherd walked directly to Miles and sat down beside him with the finality of a soldier completing his last mission, understanding that some bonds transcend duty and become destiny, that sometimes the greatest service a warrior can provide is knowing when to lay down arms and become simply a friend to someone who has survived what should have killed their ability to trust anyone ever again. As the courtroom emptied and photographers captured images of justice temporarily triumphant, Dana wondered how many other suitcases sat unnoticed in transit stations across America, how many other children had been taught that silence was survival and trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. How many other Camillas were hiding in forests and abandoned buildings with nothing but love and determination to protect innocence from systems designed to commodify vulnerability and turn human suffering into profitable enterprises? The question that would follow Dana through every subsequent case, every routine patrol, every moment of quiet reflection was not whether they had saved Miles, but whether they had saved him soon enough, and whether somewhere in the darkness beyond their victory, other children were still waiting for someone to hear the sounds that only dogs seemed capable of detecting when human ears had been trained to ignore the whispers of the lost, the forgotten, and the deliberately silenced.